Thank you very much, Rabbi Vilshansky. It's a schus for me actually to address all the Kitos Zayin Ches throughout, to share with you some of my zichronos, some of my memories of being by the Rebbe. As Rabbi Vilshansky mentioned, the minig was that many chassidim would travel to the Rebbe for the time of Tishrei, from Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and Simchaseinu. In fact, growing up as a child, I was zoiche to travel to the Rebbe, meaning I didn't grow up in Crown Heights. My family is on shlichus in Miami Beach, and for years, our family would travel to New York, most of the years for Sukkot and Simchas Torah, and some years even before Yom Kippur. Then later, when I came to Yeshiva to New York, so I was already by the Rebbe for the whole Tishrei. I'm sure many of you have already heard parts of Rosh Hashanah being by the Rebbe, v'chulhu. So I will try to continue from the time of Aseret Yemei Teshuvah to try to get as far as we can through Sukkot and Simchas Torah. But before I begin, I just want to tell you that it's very difficult to describe in words the hergeshim, the feelings that we as children growing up, as well as bochrim, and I'm sure Young Gelait felt Tishrei by the Rebbe. It's very difficult to describe it in words because it's something that your whole being, your whole essence felt being by the Rebbe. However, a little bit, something we can try to convey, which is what I will attempt to do today. So one of the highlights of Aseret Yemei Teshuvah was the famous minig that we ask the Rebbe for lekach, mebet lekach. And when you ask the Rebbe for lekach, and the Rebbe gives you this honey cake and gives us the bracha of Lashon Tova Mesukah, it's a great segula for the whole year. So generally, the Rebbe would tell lekach, would give out lekach on Erev Yom Kippur. For many, many hours, the Rebbe would stand to give out lekach by his door. People would file by, men with children would file by, and the Rebbe would give lekach. In the early years, the Rebbe would stand by the door and he would go inside his room for every single person to give lekach. In the later years, as you see, they put a table with the lekach in front of the Rebbe so the Rebbe wouldn't have to turn for every single person, and the Rebbe would distribute lekach. In the later years, it became so many people, it was almost impossible for the Rebbe to give out lekach only on Erev Yom Kippur. So the Rebbe began to give out lekach throughout Aseret Yemei Teshuvah. Different days they would announce, there was a sign from the Rebbe's maskirus, from the Rebbe's office, which days the Rebbe would be giving lekach. And they asked in the Rebbe's name, all the chassidim that were there and able to get lekach during Aseret Yemei Teshuvah and not to have to go on Erev Yom Kippur where the Rebbe would have to stand for many more hours to receive the lekach. And the Rebbe would tell everyone, Lashon Tova Mesukah. I have even a picture at home of me as a little child. Maybe it was the year Tov Lamed Ches. I don't remember the exact year. Me and my brothers were mamish little kids and were going by the Rebbe to receive lekach. It was very, very special. Some people would take that lekach, they would take a drop and they would mix it into a cake, and they would make a whole big cake of lekach made from the Rebbe's lekach. It's almost impossible to have any of that lekach today because, of course, we know the minig. We don't leave over any chametz from the Rebbe over Pesach, nor do we sell it to a goy. So therefore, it had to be eaten right away around Tishrei. People would get lekach and send a piece of lekach to their family and to their friends throughout the world to be zeichet, to have a piece of lekach from the Rebbe. In the later years, I think the Rebbe even gave $1. They put the lekach in a plastic bag, and the Rebbe had $1 inside the bag. So the Rebbe also gave a shlichus l'tzedakah together with the piece of lekach. And obviously, to keep that $1, we would take off any little bit of cake in order that we should be able to keep the Rebbe's $1 on Pesach as well. The next event, so to speak, that Klal Yisrael does before Yom Kippur is Kaporos. And Kaporos, so the way it was in Crown Heights as it is today, the Chassidim would go do Kaporos earlier than the Rebbe, and the Rebbe would come out in the morning, 7, 8 o'clock in the morning with Kaporos. The Rebbe would actually do the Seder HaKaporos in his room, and then the Rebbe would walk out holding the chicken. Many years the Rebbe would walk into the sukkah on the side. The schach wasn't up yet, but the sukkah was already, the walls were put up, and he would go over to the Sheikhet, Rabbi Yisrael Shimon Kalmanson, he'd give him the chicken, and he would shech the chicken, as you see in the photo in the sukkah. In the later years, it was done right in front of 770. Whoever was around, all the chassidim would stand around, and the Rebbe would perform kaporos. Then the Rebbe would usually go to the mikveh in the morning at Yom Kippur, and then come back and daven shachris. My Zayde, Allah Shalom, he was he had yortzat on Yom Kippur, so he had the schus every single year at Yom Kippur shachris. He was the chazan most of the years by the Rebbe at Yom Kippur. And the next thing that happened at Yom Kippur later in the afternoon was something very special. The Rebbe would come down to Mincha. There were two things that happened at Yom Kippur by Mincha. Number one, there's a minhag to give tzedakah to as many tzedakah pushkes as there are at Yom Kippur. Now you can imagine, if you go to your own shul today, how many pushkes, how many little plates are there? A few plates for tzedakah. But in Crown Heights, everyone used to put a plate for their tzedakah. Tens and tens of plates and buckets and pushkes for tzedakah, because the minhag was the Rebbe would walk in with a bag full of nickels, and the Rebbe would put tzedakah into every single plate and pushka that was there on the way. It sometimes took the Rebbe half an hour or more just to get from the back of shul to his place on Erev Yom Kippur. The Rebbe would have bags and they would have backup. If the Rebbe finished giving out, so the maskirim would have more coins for the Rebbe to give out. And there are pictures and videos of the way the Rebbe is standing and giving to every single pushka. So that's a minhag also for us. When you go to shul at Yom Kippur, ask your parents, they should come already with change and give you enough tzedakah to be able to put into every box. Therefore, the chassidim, before the Rebbe came down, would also take as much change, pennies and nickels that you had, and you would give out everything and put it into all the pushkas. Now you can imagine there are people who wanted to be zeiche to get the Rebbe's coin. Children had the chance many times to get the Rebbe's nickel. The Rebbe would give them for tzedakah. So if you had a second one, you would switch. You would give your own nickel, put it in the pushka, because the Rebbe wanted you to put it in the pushka right away, and you would be able to keep the Rebbe's nickel. So some people would have already nickels ready, and they would stand by the pushka, and as the Rebbe left, they would try to pinpoint, if it was an open box, which nickel was the Rebbe's that the Rebbe put in, and switch it right away and get another nickel. Put another nickel and to be able to have the Rebbe's tzedakah. That was a very special sight and lesson for us in the mitzvah of tzedakah. In addition of the Rebbe always giving us dollars to give to tzedakah, here you saw the Rebbe give his own tzedakah, not just giving you as a shlichus for tzedakah. Then the Rebbe would go up to his place and daven mincha. And after mincha, develop, in the beginning, the Rebbe would go up on steps and he would close his eyes. And the Rebbe, without a microphone in the early years, and the Rebbe would give a bracha to the chassidim for Erev Yom Kippur. Similar, like everyone gives his family, his children a bracha, so the Rebbe would give a bracha to all the chassidim. He would close his eyes. It was mamish, a very short bracha for a few minutes. Later years, they brought a microphone, and it even developed the bracha into a sikha. But the whole teichen, the whole idea of this sikha, it wasn't specifically like a sikha, like a fabrengen, but it was the Rebbe giving a bracha to the chassidim, and as well as Klal Yisrael, the Rebbe would give a bracha. It was a very, very serious moment and quiet. I remember one year, the Rebbe spoke for a very long time, a sikha. It finished very, very late, and everyone had to run home to eat the Sudam Mafsekes and the Bochrim, as we'll see soon, Birchas Abonim, to go run back to be by the Rebbe. But this was a very special moment for all the chassidim. After Mincha, after the Rebbe gave this bracha, the Rebbe would go back to his room. Everyone went home to eat the Suda HaMafsekes, go to the final time of the mikveh, and come back to 770 for Kol Nidrei. But what most people, Yungelite, married people, didn't realize at the time, or they forgot, there was something else very, very special that happened afterwards. It started in the early years. The Rebbe told the Bochrim, who is the father, the Ruchnizdike father of all the Bochrim in Yeshiva, is the Rebbe. So the Rebbe would call the Bochrim into his room, and the Rebbe would give birchas habonim. The Rebbe would give a bracha like a father gives his child a bracha before Yom Kippur. Yivarechecha, you say the bracha. The Rebbe would also give a bracha to the Bochrim. As the crowd became bigger, the Rebbe started to give the bracha in Gan Eden Atachne right outside his room. And then eventually, the Rebbe would go into the shul upstairs. And I want to describe to you, the shul was set up special for the Bochrim. They would take out the bookshelves in the back of the upstairs Beis Medrash. It's hard to understand, imagine what it is. And the Bochrim would fill up the shul, fill up the small Beis Medrash upstairs, plus the Cheder Sheni, the second room, and they took out the bookshelves, so you're able to see the Rebbe straight through. As well, they took out the whole window frame to the chutzner where the sukkah is, that was also where the Bochrim would stand by the window to be able to see the Rebbe. As you see in this picture, the way the Rebbe is standing giving the bracha, and I'll describe it to you. There was so many Bochrim, everybody who didn't want to be next to the Rebbe when the Rebbe gave a bracha to the Bochrim. I was zeiche a number of years to be there as a Bocher over Bar Mitzvah to be able to receive this bracha from the Rebbe. So they had a seder. It went by age. If you were over a certain age, 22 or 23, you were able to get into the Beis Medrash to be mamish next to the Rebbe. A little younger, you had to be in Cheder Sheni, in the second room. And a little younger, you had to be outside by the window. And everybody kept to that order, to that seder, or else it would be impossible to control who goes in. And they would actually close the sukkah. You couldn't get into the sukkah whole lot of Yom Kippur. You had to wait online. The Bochrim would wait online. And they would open it a few minutes before the bracha. And all the Bochrim would go in, catch their places for this very special, close moment with the Rebbe. In fact, until Tafshin Mem Tes, by the bracha Rebbe, Shlicht, the Rebbe used to ben Shlicht, and it was still early, so you were able to hear the bracha. In Miami, I remember, we used to hear a hookup live of this bracha to the Bochrim. But after Tafshin Mem Ches, after the Istalkos of the Rebbetzin, so the Rebbe was already Mekabel Yom Tif. The Rebbe used to ben Shlicht. So when the Rebbe came in, Yom Tif for the Rebbe, so there was no microphone. So you can imagine the pushing to hear the words of the Rebbe. And it was such a special moment. If you can see in the picture, the Rebbe would take his talus and he would cover his eyes with his talus. Almost never did the Rebbe cover the talus over his eyes. Always over his head, except for Tkiyas Shofar and the Barucha to the Bochrim. And the Rebbe would hold his talus. Here the Rebbe is holding it on the outside. I remember the Rebbe holding the talus from the inside, like by Tkiyas Shofar, over his head with his hands up, holding the talus. And the Rebbe started off with the bracha Vaydaber Yivorechecha, and then the Rebbe gave a special bracha to the Bochrim. Some years, the early years, the bracha was finished early enough that there was time still to write up the bracha and type it up and give it out. In the later years, it was already late. The bracha became longer. So obviously, the chayzrim, those that had to chazer the Rebbe Sichos, had to remember the bracha because there was no tape anymore, and write it down Mitzvah Yom Kippur to be able to be published. The bracha that the Rebbe said, the special bracha to the Temimim. It was such a special moment that it's very difficult to describe the feelings of the Bochrim standing there, hearing a bracha from our Ruchni's Diketata, from our father, from the Rebbe, giving a bracha mamish as a father gives a bracha to his children. Right from that bracha, the Rebbe would go straight downstairs. Didn't go back to his room usually. He went straight downstairs for Kol Nidrei. The Rebbe would go downstairs to his place, and the Seder was, they started with Tillim. Still early, couldn't say Kol Nidrei yet, and they would say Tillim for a while. Then, after Tillim was done, whatever amount of Tillim was said, and the Bochrim, remember, we weren't always there in the beginning because we were still upstairs getting ready to come downstairs for Kol Nidrei after the Bracha Birchas Habonim, but that we would make our ways down. The Rebbe was already in his place, and then the Rebbe would go off his stage for Kol Nidrei. Most of us who were not close in the front couldn't see the Rebbe by Kol Nidrei. Why is that? Because it says, if you take a look in your Machzor, it says, the Alter Rebbe writes, it's a mitzvah gedola to hold the first Sefer Torah by Kol Nidrei. 3 Rabbonim, Mechoshev Yidden, would hold the Sefer Torah like a Bezdin by the Chazan for Kol Nidrei. The Rebbe, of course, got the first Sefer Torah. So the Rebbe would come down from his stage, from his bimah, and the Rebbe would, on the floor, stand holding his Sefer Torah, the Rebbe Sefer Torah, for the whole entire Kol Nidrei next to the Chazan. So most Chassidim did not see the Rebbe by Kol Nidrei. And afterwards, the Rebbe would go back up on his bimah, and they finished davening Ma'ariv. After Ma'ariv, the Seder was, the whole Tillim was recited b'tzibur, with a minyan. The whole Tillim was recited. There were people who had the chazakah to be a chazan for this Seder Tehillim, and the Rebbe would stay for the whole Tillim. In fact, in Tofshin Nun Aleph and Tofshin Nun Beis, if I'm not mistaken, I didn't check this, but this is from my memory, after the chazan finished saying Tehillim, the Rebbe still didn't finish. The chazan said it very fast. So the Rebbe was still saying Tillim. The Rebbe stayed in his place for another 45 minutes or half an hour or 45 minutes after Tillim and finished the whole Tillim. Usually Shabbos Mevorchim, if the Rebbe didn't finish Tillim, the Rebbe would take his Tillim, he would put his finger where he was holding, and he would leave shul when the chazan finished. Even though he wasn't finished, he would finish in his room. But these 2 years on Yom Kippur, the Rebbe stayed to finish Tillim. Actually, I heard that in the early years, in the Yuds, once a similar thing happened. the Chazan finished the Tillim very fast. So the Rebbe walked over to the Omid, and the Rebbe continued from where he was holding as the Chazan and said the whole Tillim, and finished saying the whole Tillim. I think it was Tafshin Yud Dalet in 1953 when the Rebbe finished as the Chazan. But in Nun Aleph and Nun Beis, he stayed in his place, and the Rebbe concluded saying the whole Tillim, and then the Rebbe left. One of the interesting inyonim that we saw on Yom Kippur, the Rebbe had a red handkerchief. One belonged to one of the Rabbeim. I don't remember now from which Rebbe. Maybe it's a Tzedek. And the Rebbe would have that by Tkiyas, but on Yom Kippur, the Rebbe would wear it. He would put it around his shoulder. I myself saw, the Rebbe would try to hide it inside his kapote, which was under the Rebbe's kittel. But I myself saw the Rebbe walking out more than once, and you were able to see this red special handkerchief sticking out from the Rebbe's kapote, and the Rebbe would wear it on Yom Kippur. Bechlal, it's known that Yidden who have special begodim from tzaddikim sometimes put these begodim on Yom Kippur. The next morning, of course, the Rebbe would come down to davening. Davening was regular on Yom Kippur, with the Rebbe obviously, following along with the Chazan. Bochrim and people would try to see the Rebbe fall koidim. I don't know if I ever saw, because there was a big crowd and it was hard to see the Rebbe fall koidim. The Rebbe did it very, very fast. And if you remember, the Rebbe was on in his years, and it wasn't easy. But nevertheless, the Rebbe didn't have any help, and he used to do koidim by himself and get up by himself. And the Rebbe got at Mincha, the Rebbe got Mafter Yoina. And then the highlight of Yom Kippur was Napoleon's March. We all know by the last Kaddish, after we say Shema Yisrael, Baruch Shem, and Hashem Hu Elikim 7 times, the Chazan says Kaddish, and then the minig in Chabad is we sing a march of victory of Nitzachim, that Baruch Hashem has given us everything that we need, and we had La'alta L'chaim U'Shalom, and Chassidim, we celebrate that with a march, and the Rebbe would dance to this march, to Napoleon's March. Now, in the early years, I think I was Zoiche once, Tafshim Mem Beis, I was there in Kippur once early, and I was Zoiche to be there when the Rebbe still got up on his chair. The Rebbe would literally get up on his own chair, and the Rebbe would stand and dance on his chair. It's a sight which is almost impossible to describe. The Rebbe would take his talus, another time, and he would throw his talus over his head completely. Sometimes the Chassidim who were close would hear the Rebbe cry. The Rebbe would cry by this niggin and make with his hand so strong, so lebedik. It's impossible to describe. There's obviously no videos of this. In the later years, they actually built steps, and they have pictures of the steps, drawings of the steps. And the Rebbe would stand by his place for a few minutes, and then he would turn around and walk up on the steps. And he would walk up on the steps, and he would turn around and face the oilam, face the whole 770, and he would throw his talus over himself. The talus would sometimes come off his shoulders because the Rebbe would make so strong. And everyone, remember, after a tonus, people, Chassidim, were weak. I can tell you this, kipshutoi, and some years I can tell you this for myself. I didn't fast well in those years as a bacher, and it was very difficult to push to see the Rebbe by Napoleon's March, but the whole 770 was able to see because the Rebbe got up higher. Nobody during Napoleon's March felt hungry. Nobody thought about food. Nobody thought about drinking. A minute before, you could have been a bacharel or a kid thinking, I can't wait to get that piece of cake, right? When he came to Napoleon's March and everyone was dancing, you were transported into a different oilam, into an oilam of ruchnius, of being and dancing with the Rebbe. It's something that's impossible to describe. And most of us who were there, when we dance now Napoleon's March, when it comes at the end of Yom Kippur, wherever we are, it doesn't matter if you're in 770, the oil, or in your own shul, or in a Chabad house, or in someone else's shul. If you picture or try to imagine yourselves, even if you weren't there, of course, how it would have been and how it was by the Rebbe, you will also be transported to a different place. You won't think about food. You won't think about gashmis. You'll only think about this special moment on Motzei Yom Kippur. Then the Rebbe Ma'ariv was over. And the Rebbe would obviously, we know we wear a hat and a talus by Ma'ariv, which was the Rebbe would put on his hat. He would bring in his hat to Mincha. And afterwards, the Rebbe would turn around and he would say, here you see a picture of the Rebbe standing on the steps. The Rebbe would turn around and wish everyone good Yom Tif. Just like on Yom Tif after davening, the Rebbe would scream 3 times, good Yom Tif, good Yom Tif, good Yom Tif. Right after Ma'ariv, after it was finished, the Rebbe would scream loud to the Olam, and he would say loud, Gut Yom Tov 3 times. Everyone said Gut Yom Tov, and many times the Rebbe even started the niggin, sometimes with Samachto. I think even once his father's niggin, started niggin, the Rebbe would walk out very, very lebedik. From the Rebbe's room, he would come out to Kiddush Levana. The minigins, we do Kiddush Levana before we break our fast. Someone made Havdalah actually at 770, and then the Rebbe would come out to Kiddush Levana. I remember one year, just a small little anecdote. It was Tov Shemem Tes, and the Rebbe was Chazan. He davened for the Omid in the Shnasa Avelus of the Rebbetzin. So the Rebbe turned around, and he wanted to know if there's going to be Kiddush Levana. The Rebbe wanted to know before he left the shul. So someone went out and came back, and one of the helpers of the Rebbe told the Rebbe, "Nishtokin Levana. There's no Levana." So the Rebbe laughed. You could see there's a video, you see the Rebbe standing and smiling. Why is the Rebbe smiling? Because the Rebbe answered, "Shedoa Levana, non mekenen nish zen." The Rebbe said, "There is a Levana." I think this is the picture. The Rebbe is smiling on the floor by davening for the Omid. Said, "There is a Levana. You just can't see it." There's no Levana. Of course, there's a Levana. And the Rebbe, with that, announced Gut Yom Tov and left the shul besimcha. After Yom Kippur came the time, the Hachona, for Zman Simchaseinu. The Rebbe had a special sukkah. Actually, the Rebbe had 2 sukkahs. There was the beautiful sukkah that's built now. If you drive by and go to 770 now, on sukkahs, you'll see in front of the Rebbe's room, there's a beautiful sukkah with a special cover. Very, very expensive, classy sukkah that was built for the Rebbe, which the Rebbe used to use. But later years, when the Rebbe started to spend more time in 770, and the Rebbe needed to go eat something, and it wasn't anybody's business to be involved in the Rebbe's privacy when he eats and when he learns. So they built another sukkah right by the driveway, by the door where the Rebbe used to go. And when he came back from the oil, they built a separate sukkah, special sukkah for the Rebbe, where the Rebbe was able to use whenever he wanted. And even later than that, they transformed one of the offices next to the Rebbe's room. They cut a hole in the roof, and they made that also into a sukkah. In fact, the Rebbe even gave lekach from that sukkah on the Shaina Rabbah. If we'll have time, we'll get to that in the later years. I was never zeicha to see that sukkah because I always got lekach earlier, so I was never around to get that sukkah. But there were special bochrim who had a chazaka to have the schus to partake in building the Rebbe's sukkah. They had a sink and they had svarim in there and they had a carpet. Sometimes we were able to peek in when they built the sukkah. It was a very special sight, this sukkah. Then came Erev Sukkos. Erev Sukkos, a few special things happened upstairs by the Rebbe's room in private that most people were not allowed to be there. I was zoiche to be there once, probably inappropriately, but I ended up being in there, so I could at least describe something of what I saw. The Seder was the Rebbe had to choose Daled Minim, right? So what happened? So the Seichrim who had a chazaka to bring the Rebbe his Daled Minim would bring the Rebbe, Lulav HaHodas and Lulav Hadassim, Esregim, and Arovis, everything. And the Rebbe would choose. What would the Rebbe choose? The Rebbe wouldn't only choose for himself. The Rebbe chose for himself a Lulav and Esreg, more than one. And the Rebbe chose for the Rebbetzin, Lulav and Esreg. And then the Rebbe chose a whole bunch of Lulavim and Esregim that he would distribute to special people, Hara Chazakah. The Rebbe would give them Daled Minim, some the Rebbe would give just a Lulav, just an Esreg, Hadassim, and sometimes it was a Zoicha Begoidel from Eretz Yisrael who went on the list, and a list that Rebbe had a detailed list of who was supposed to get the Daled Minim. In fact, there are videos in the NEMS where the Rebbe puts on his glasses and you see the Rebbe standing with the list, and the Rebbe is going through the list and checking people. Okay, this is what you're supposed to take. This is what you're supposed to take. The Rebbe controlled the situation, Erev Sukkos, to give out the Chalukas Hadaled Minim. And there are pictures of these special Yidden. And I say special, they were special because they had this great schus. I don't even know how that developed, to be able to receive Daled Minim from the Rebbe. And then they would go by the Rebbe. Some went into the Rebbe's room. They would go by the Rebbe, and the Rebbe gave them a special bracha, every single one of them. And the bracha was as follows: Mamshich zayin ala hamshoches al kol hashona kula. To be mamshich, to bring down all these great hamshoches and ruchnius that's happening now through the lulav and the esrog to Daled Minim. It should be nimshach al kol hashana kula, throughout the whole year. That's what the Rebbe said to these people. Every single one of them would go by, and the Rebbe gave the bracha. Mamshich zayin al hamshoches al kol hashana kula. There's even a number of stories of certain chassidim that the Rebbe said, didn't say. That's not the time now to discuss that, but that was the seder. After the Rebbe gave out the talmidim, you see here the Elter Chassidim, in those years they used to go into the Rebbe's room, that's the Mendel Futterfast, and the Rebbe would tell them, in the later years they would file by the Rebbe's room. After that, as we all know, that the Rebbe asked many, many years ago that they should take seeds from the Yanever Esroigim, from Calabria Esroigim, which we make a bracha on, and to plant those seeds over in Eretz Yisrael, to have Eretz Yisrael the Esroigim made from Calabria Esroigim. Those people who had these pardesim, these fields of Esroigim, had the schus that they would bring the Rebbe every year out of Sukkot. They would present the Rebbe with the best Esroigim that they had from Kfar Chabad. And these Yidden had the schus. There's a picture here. You see them going over to the Rebbe and giving the Rebbe as a gift for Sukkot the Esroigim from Kfar Chabad. They say that the Rebbe would even make nanuyim, not a brocha, the brocha he made on the Yanever Esrog that he chose, but the Rebbe would make the nanuyim also in his room on one of these Kfar Chabad Esrogim. And the Seder was, they would give the Rebbe the Esrogim, and you see there's a microphone next to the Rebbe, because the Rebbe would give them a brocha, a special brocha, to the Yidden in Kfar Chabad, and in response for giving the Rebbe the Esrogim from Kfar Chabad. So one year I was actually there standing on the steps, me and my friend, while towards the end of when the Rebbe distributed the Lovim and the Esrogim. And then the Kfar Chabad Yidden presented the Rebbe with the Esrog, and the Rebbe was standing and saying a sikha, giving a brocha, which was, the microphones were able to hear it outside, so everybody was doing whatever they were doing. Suddenly you heard the Rebbe's voice, you stopped. That's what everyone did, stopped. You listened to the sikha, because almost no one was in here, only special people from Kfar Chabad, and some of the Yidden who got a special lulav and esrog from the Rebbe. And then the Rebbe would, in some years, he would make, the early years, he would make his lulav and esrog himself. In the later years, he would give it to Rebbe David Raskin. That's a picture of all the esrogim of Kfar Chabad that were presented to the Rebbe. The Rebbe would give the esrog to Rebbe, his lulav, his dalad minim to Rebbe David Raskin. And the Rebbe told him exactly how many hadassim. You can see on a video, the Rebbe told him to put one lulav with 36 hadassim, another one with 18 hadassim, and the Rebbe told him you can cut the lulav. I think he said it doesn't matter. Make sure that the lulav is done properly. Then came the first night of Sukkot. Now, the first night of Sukkot, something very special began to happen in the year Tafshin Mem Aleph, which was a Shnas Hakil. The Rebbe began from that year to say a Sikha every single night of Sukkot. And these Sikhs, the Rebbe would explain usually the Ushpizen, the connection of the Ushpizen of that day to that day. In addition, the Chassidish Ushpizen. So the first day was the Baal Shem Tov and Avram Avinu, and the Rebbe would explain that connected to the first day of Sukkot. It became, throughout the years, a highlight for many Yidden from other parts of New York, not Lubavitch Chassidim, Yidden with Streimlach, Yidden without beards, who would come for their Simchas Beis HaShe'eva family get-together. Where would they go? They would come to 770 to hear the Sikha of the Rebbe on Simchas Beis HaShe'eva every single night, usually on Chol Hamoed. And it began on Yom Tif. Yom Tif, there was no microphone. So everyone would gather around the Rebbe's shtender, as you see here. And the Rebbe would say a sikha. Sometimes if it was Shabbos, the Rebbe said 2 sikhs one year. He said 1 sikha about the Ushpizen. He finished with a bracha. They sang a nigun. People thought the Rebbe is finished. They left maybe. And then the Rebbe said another sikha. He explained Pshat and Arashi. The Rebbe used to explain sometimes Arashi by Fabrengen. There was no Fabrengen Shabbos Sukkos. The Rebbe explained Arashi. I think it was the year Tafshin Mem Tes or Tafshinun. The Rebbe explained Arashi. This is not part of the program, but I will describe to you something very interesting that I recall about these sikhs. In the year Tafshin Nun Beis, so there was an idea that instead of the Rebbe saying the sikha by his regular sikha place, maybe if the Rebbe says the sikha by the Fabrengen place, more people can hear, and maybe even the Rebbe would sit down. There was an idea. So they put platforms from the Rebbe's place all the way to the Fabrengen place, and the Rebbe turned around after davening. No, he's waiting for the sikha. So the secretaries told the Rebbe the sikha is going to be by the Fabrengen place. Okay, so the Rebbe walked all the way to the Fabrengen place, and there's no stender. So the secretary, the masker, told the Rebbe the chair the Rebbe should sit. The Rebbe didn't want to sit. And the Rebbe looked around. There was no stender. And again, they showed the Rebbe the chair. The Rebbe didn't want to sit. So the Rebbe said a sikha this time, the only time is Tama, that the Rebbe said a sikha standing by his Fabrengen table with his hands like this on the table, standing for the whole time of the sikha without a stender, without sitting, standing and talking, standing straight by the table. It's an unbelievable tziyur and sight that I recall. And the next night already, the Rebbe said the sikha in the same place, but they actually brought a stender. Now the first night, after the sikha, something special happened that I was never there. Some of my friends managed to be there. Now, you know, the orchim, the guests who came for Tishrei, who didn't have a place where to eat or stay, let's say Bachrim or Jungelite, so there was a special vad, hachnosas orchim, that they would provide food for the orchim, much as it is today. So where would they eat on Sukkot? In the Sukkah. They would prepare all the meals for the orchim in the Sukkah. So the first night, before they made Kiddush, the Rebbe, after Ma'ariv, after the Sikha, the Rebbe would go, instead of to his room, maybe he went to his room for a minute, he would go into the Sukkah, and all the Orchim were packed in the Sukkah, and the Rebbe would say a bracha to the Orchim. Now, why was I not there? Because I was by the Sikha downstairs. I also didn't belong there, because I wasn't one of the Orchim eating in the Sukkah, but it was impossible to make it from the place of the Sikha all the way into the Sukkah, which was packed, jammed with people. Could you imagine the Sukkah packed with so many Orchim to hear this bracha? Some of my friends somehow managed to be by the Sikha and by the bracha to the Orchim. But usually the Orchim that were there in the Sukkah, they usually didn't hear the Sikha because they were waiting for the special bracha that the Rebbe is going to tell them. And the Rebbe would go into the Sukkah. I was never there. And the Rebbe would speak to the Orchim for a few minutes, give them a bracha. And then the Rebbe would go back to his room or home or to the library for the Sudas Yom Tif. After that, of course, everyone ate their Suda, then went to Montgomery and Kingston to dance for Simchas Beis Hashayevo till the wee hours in the morning. And then started the first day of Sukkot. There's a special minhag that began many years ago that Chassidim wanted to bench Lulav and Esrig on the Rebbe's Esrig. And the Rebbe allowed it. The Rebbe, in his goodness and kindness, allowed the Chassidim to bench on his Lulav and Esrig. In fact, someone once asked the Rebbe, isn't it true that when so many people bench on your Esrig, it loses its beauty? It's not a real hodar anymore. The Rebbe's Esrig was the most beautiful Esrig. You can imagine everyone brought the Rebbe the best. By the time the third day of Yom Tov came, it didn't look so nice anymore. It was brown. So the Rebbe answered, there's no greater hidur and hodar in an Esrig that so many Yidden make a bracha on that Esrig. That itself is the hodar, even though physically it doesn't necessarily look like the most beautiful Esrig. In the early years, they say the Rebbe would sit in the sukkah, in his own sukkah, and people would walk in and bench Esrik. Later, there was a Yid, Meir Harlik, he should be gesund and well, his 120 year, who had the schus, that he was the one in charge of the Rebbe's Lulav and Esrik to give the Chassidim to bench. So the Seder was as follows. On Yom Tif, the Rebbe would come out to bench Lulav and Esrik at 8 o'clock in the morning. Davening was 10 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning. Chol Hamoed, the Rebbe would come at 9 o'clock in the morning. But Yom Tif, 8 o'clock in the morning. They would give out tickets. You had to come earlier on Yom Tif, and they would give you tickets. So you shouldn't have to stand on line for a long time. You would know around what number they're holding, and you would get into the line to be able to bench Lulav and Esrik. But the Rebbe would come out with his Lulav and Esrik, and he would go into the sukkah. The Meir Halak would open the sukkah for the Rebbe. The Rebbe went in, and the Rebbe benched his own Lulav and Esrik. After a few minutes, the Rebbe would open the door. The Meir Halak would go in, and the Rebbe would give him the Lulav and Esrik. And the Rebbe would tell him, Matona amanas lahachzer, like it says in Yom Yom, that you're supposed to say, Matona amanas lahachzer, and that's a te'elis, that's a benefit for the Noisin and the Mekabel, for both. And he would take that Lulav and Esrik, and then the line would start. And everyone had the schus who would walk by and bench Lulav and Esrik. The first day, it took double as long, because you have to make 2 brachas. From the second day and on, it took a little quicker, because you only make 1 bracha. Hundreds and hundreds of Yidden would file by and bench Lulav and Esrig on the Rebbe's Esrig. Afterwards, now you didn't do the Nanuyim. The Seder was you just said the bracha and you gave it a shake. And then you went into the Sukkah and you took your own Lulav and Esrig if you had the Nanuyim. Us Bochrim, we didn't have our own Lulav and Esrig, so we had to find someone to bench Lulav and Esrig. I just want to share something. This is not specifically a story about the Rebbe, but something that I remember that I didn't even know touched me. There was a Yid who would stand, and he had a Lulav and Esrik, and everybody would ask him, oh, he's standing with Lulav and Esrik, can I do the Nanuyim? Can I do the shaking? He would let, and I felt bad for him because he never got a chance to put it away. Because another guy came over, I didn't realize till much later, he was one of the Yidden who used to give the Rebbe an esrog for Kfar Chabad, and he was zoiche to get dalad minim for the Rebbe. So his dalad minim set was really from the Rebbe, and he did that as a mitzvah. He would stand for hours giving Yidden the opportunity to do the nanuim on that lulav and esrog. I had no idea that I was doing a bachadol, doing nanuim on the Rebbe's esrog. A moiridik mesidus nefesh didn't have to do that. He didn't have to stand for hours. They used to have zaynis and coffee in the sukkah. Something special happened in the year Tafshin Nun Beis. Many of you might have heard this, and if not, I'll share it with you now. The first day of Sukkot is the year Tafshin Nun Beis, which was the last year that we were able, which the Rebbe was healthy and when the Rebbe finished benching and he opened the door for the Meir Harlik, so the Meir Harlik took the Rebbe's lulav and esrog, and the Rebbe started to follow him. And the Rebbe asked him, where do you go to bench lulav and esrog for the oilam? So he told the Rebbe they built a little sukkah at the end of the sukkah in the later years, special little room, special for that. So the Rebbe said, okay. The Rebbe followed, no one knew what's happening. The Rebbe followed the Meir Harlik all the way to the sukkah. And the Meir Harlik stood himself by the place where you're supposed to, where he stood and everyone filed by him. And right next to him is standing, the Rebbe is not moving, the Rebbe is watching. And the Rebbe stood there from about 8 o'clock, 8:30 in the morning, whenever the Rebbe came out, till about 2:30 in the afternoon. Can you imagine? Hours upon hours upon hours. And the Rebbe watched every single chassid go by and make 2 brachas. In fact, the Rebbe reminded some people they forgot Shechionu. Can you imagine? People walked in the beginning, they had no idea. When I came already, we all knew the Rebbe's there. But the first few people, they had no idea the Rebbe's there. Can you imagine walking in and you see the Rebbe standing there? Some of them forgot to make a Shechionu. The Rebbe reminded them to make a Shechionu. Someone went over to the Rebbe and says, maybe the Rebbe should sit down. One he told the Rebbe, whatever you're doing, you could do it sitting. And the Rebbe just smiled. The Rebbe wouldn't sit. The Rebbe stood there the whole time and came down to Shachris, late in the afternoon. They davened Shachris and Mincha right away. And that night the Rebbe said a Sikha. Another Sikha after all this. The Rebbe stood for so many hours. It was a very, very special thing. That's very difficult to describe. The Rebbe standing the whole time, the first day of Sukkot, and watching everyone bench lulav and esrog. Now the Rebbe's lulav and esrog would stay for the oilam. The Rebbe didn't come into shul with his lulav and esrog. Before Hallel, you see in the picture that Meir Harlik and Cholomoid, the pictures from, would bring Rebbe's lulav. People would tell them where they're holding in davening, and he would bring the Rebbe's lulav and esrog to the Rebbe to be able to use for Hallel and Shainis. And the Rebbe left his medrash after shul, after davening lulav and esrog, and then a short while later, he gave it out again for people who still didn't bench lulav and esrog to be able to bench after davening. Once I benched lulav and esrog after davening because I went with a group of my friends on Morristown to a prison to be Mesameach, the Yidden on Sukkot to a prison and to bench with them lulav and esrog. So we had to leave early in the morning. So what we did was we davened till Hallel. And then when we came back to 770, we benched lulav and esrog on the Rebbe's esrog, which was already after davening. I still remember I was a young bacher and I didn't, I wasn't so careful, but it wasn't no line. So the Meir Harlik was standing there. There was no one around. So I took the Rebbe's lulav and esrog and I did all the nanuim. And he started to scream at me, Mechutzif. He's right. Who are you to do nanuim on the Rebbe's esrog? It's the Rebbe's esrog. But that's what I did because there was no one standing there. I just took the Rebbe's lulav and esrog and I did the nanuim. So looking back, I had the schus once to do the nanuim, all the nanuim on the Rebbe's lulav and esrog. And the same thing was the second day of Yom Tif. There was another sikha, the second night of Yom Tif. Then there was a sikha also on Matzoi Yom Tif. And then Cholamoyed, the Rebbe would come in 9 o'clock to give out his lulav and esrog, and the same seder happened. I'll just share with you a short story that happened with me on one of these days on Sukkot. Two short stories. One short story is I was bar mitzvah already. It was the year, I think, Tafshin Memvov. And I was punkt standing upstairs when the Rebbe came out at 9 o'clock with his lulav and esrog by the pushke. And the Rebbe gave out tzedakah. So I wasn't expecting to get tzedakah because I was already bar mitzvah with a hat that the Rebbe usually gave the kids, but I was standing there and the Rebbe gave me a dime. But I was so lost that the dime fell on the floor. So I bent down to pick it up. Rabbi Grona taps me on the shoulder and the Rebbe is making with his hand, he wants the dime back. So I gave the Rebbe the dime back and the Rebbe gave me a different dime to put in the pushka. That's one short story. Second one connects to the picture that you see. The Rebbe would come to shul on Chol Hamoed. It stopped in the later years, but in the memories, the Rebbe would give tzedakah to the kids. There were so many kids there, Chol Hamoed. You can imagine. It took the Rebbe sometimes 45 minutes from walking into shul until he got to his place. And in Tishrei with the Rebbe video, you could see they showed the clock. It was 10:40. The Rebbe came at 10. He was giving out tzedakah to the kids. There were kids piled like this around, and the Rebbe would give tzedakah to everybody. One year, I was a young child. We were standing around in 770. There was a double pushka. That's where we were standing. And the Rebbe started to give out to the kids. I'm telling you as a child what was going through my mind. And I can't tell you right now as an adult. Going through my mind was that it's chutzpahdik to stick your hand out to the Rebbe to get a nickel. If the Rebbe wants to give me, he'll give me. This was going through my mind as a 7, 8-year-old kid. I have no idea why. So, of course, I didn't stick my hand out. And I didn't get a nickel. And I felt terrible. I felt very bad. Everyone got, all the kids got, and I didn't get. So I decided tomorrow I'm going to be chutzpah. I'm going to stick out my hand. So the next day, Chol Hamoed, came to shul, and I'm standing. I stood in the front of all the kids. I have to get tzedakah from the Rebbe, and I was standing there, and I stuck out my hand, and the Rebbe gives me tzedakah first. He actually, one of the first, he gave me a quarter. So I felt, as a little kid, I got even more. Instead of a nickel, the Rebbe used to give nickels. I got a quarter. And the Rebbe gave all the kids. After the Rebbe finished giving all the kids, he asked, did you get yet? And he made sure that maybe because yesterday I didn't get that, if all the he turned around to me and he made sure that I got tzedakah. And of course, the rest of there were Miftzayim, Sukkah mobiles, and Bachram would join, going on Miftzayim, putting mitzvahs dalad minim with Yidden. One of the days of Chol Hamoed, there was a rally for the kids. And then came Shana Rabbah. There was also a Sikha. The picture you see here, there was one year that Rebbe had a special rally for the kids from the NCFJE, from the Shir Limud Adas, from the kids that came together. That had a special rally for them. There's a video of it. Came Leila Shana Rabbah. The Rebbe would come out to Tilim at 1 o'clock in the morning. The Rebbe came out to Tilim. Some years the Rebbe came with a Tilim Yahal Oir from the Tzemach Tzedek, Tilim with Yurim up Chassidus, an old Tilim. And the Rebbe said Tilim, and that Tilim many years, put on glasses, and the Rebbe said Tilim. Tilim went from 1 o'clock in the morning till about 2:30 in the morning. And remember, the next day is the Shana Rabbah. And the Shana Rabbah, the Rebbe would come out to Shacharis and the 7 times HaKofis and the whole long davening. And after the davening, after everything, the Rebbe would then give lekach, which in the later years, the Rebbe began to give lekach again earlier on Chol Hamoed. Who was the lekach for? We know that it says in Sfarim that a Shana Rabbah is sort of the end of Yom Kippur. So anyone who wasn't able to get lekach before Yom Kippur, which were many orchim, myself included, when we used to come in for sukkahs, we would have the schus. The Rebbe would give lekach by the sukkah to all these Yidden, and the Rebbe would give the women, I believe, also lekach on the Shana Rabbah. I don't remember if the Rebbe gave Erev Yom Kippur to the women, but on Shana Rabbah, the Rebbe gave to the women also lekach. And we stand by the sukkah, and in the later years, the Rebbe would give it by his sukkah that they made next to the Rebbe's room, the sukkah where they cut out in the roof. The Rebbe would give out lekach. And then came the highlight, so to speak, if you can even say that, because every day was special, of the end of Sukkot, which was Shmini Atzeres and Simchas Torah. I'll spend just a few minutes about that. As a kid, being by the Rebbe, Shmini Atzeres and Simchas Torah was the highlight of my whole year. As a kid growing up, we came to the Rebbe twice a year. We came for Sukkot and for Pesach. And even later when I came to Yeshiva and I was by the Rebbe the whole time, and every Fabrengen was special. Every single day davening with the Rebbe was special. Shachris, Minchen, Ma'ariv. Every Sikha was special. But there was something about Shmini Atzeres and Simchas Torah that's very difficult to describe. So first of all, 770 was emptied out. Hishana Rabbah in the afternoon. If you came late, you had to daven in the chotze, to daven outside. And if it was raining, too bad. because they would empty out 770. They had to set up 770 special with bleachers on the side, in the back, in the front. They set up the ches in the middle where the Rebbe would dance, the Rebbe's bima, the Rebbe's stender. There was a whole system every year with a whole vad, the whole committee that was in charge of setting up 770 for hakafas. They would open the doors late in the afternoon. There's video still because it's before Yom Tov, everybody going in, and many people had mekoymes kavuyim. They had set places like by Fabrengen and by Tchias Shofar. So likewise for hakafas. In fact, my place was, how do I have a place? Because when we were kids, so our parents, me and a few of my chavedim, their place was next to the Rebbe's bima. So we were kids. Where were we? We were on top of the tables in front of the Rebbe's bima. That's where we sat. But when we became bachrim, we just sort of stayed there. So that ended up being my place, basically by the Oren Kodesh. That's where my place was for hakafas. Hakafas began really before hakafas began by Ma'ariv. The Rebbe would come in to Ma'ariv bismana, which is, let's say, around, depending on the year. A year like this would be, let's say, 7 o'clock, 7:15 was Ma'ariv. The Rebbe would come into Ma'ariv, and there was a niggin. They sang every time when the Rebbe came into Ma'ariv and hakafas. It's a famous niggin. It's not only a Lubavitch niggin. It's a Veltish niggin as well. And that niggin. And the Rebbe would come in, and he would, almost every year, he would put down his siddur, and he would turn around, and he would dance, like Bahakofis. Usually the Rebbe came in, so he made a few times with his hand. He put down his siddur and turned around, and the Rebbe started to clap and to make with his hands. Very, very lebedik. For Ma'ariv. After Ma'ariv, so in the year Tafshin and Beis, actually, the Rebbe said a sikha. I was standing right there, I remember. In fact, the Rebbe turned around, and the Gabbai had announced the Seder. He announced what's going to happen now. They're going to go make Kiddush, and then come back for our coffers at 9 o'clock. So the Rebbe started off as Gabbai is a Rosh Tevis, Ono b'choyach gedulas yamincha. The Rosh Tevis, the word Gabbai, is the tefillah of Ono b'choyach gedulas yamincha. Then the Rebbe said a few words about the fact that the Gabbai made this announcement. The Rebbe gave a bracha then with the whole Aleph base, which the Rebbe did many times. He did it this year also. Aleph, Shnas Eiro, Shnas Bracha, etc. What I found interesting was the minute the Rebbe started to say the Sikha, the Rebbe said the first sentence, and everybody came crashing to hear the Sikha. So the Rebbe stopped. He waited till it calmed down. And then the Rebbe repeated what he said, word for word. The first sentence that he said, he repeated it word for word and started from the beginning of the Sikha again. And Hakafis was announced for 9 o'clock. So after Ma'ariv, which was very lebedik, everyone ran to make Kiddush in whatever sukkah or in 770 or home or in someone's house, wherever you were staying, made Kiddush, and then came back to 770 for Hakafis. The Rebbe used to come into Hakafis. You could imagine the crowds. It was packed. It was so hard to make for the Rebbe a shvil, to make for the Rebbe a path. Sometimes the Vada Masada would stand and separate and hold the oilam that the Rebbe should be able, they would walk in front of the Rebbe like this, so the Rebbe should be able to get through to his place. And again, the Rebbe came to his place, and he would put down his siddur, and he would dance. And then began the Ataharesas. They say there was, now I have to remember correctly, if Shmini Atzeres as well, or only Simchas Torah, that the Rebbe said the whole Atoresa. I think it was only Simchas Torah, but Shmini Atzeres, the Rebbe always said the first pasuk and the last pasuk. So there would be Mechabed, the Rebbe with Atoresa. Is Mechabed, the Rebbe would say the pasuk. You're able to hear it. It was loud. The Rebbe said it loud. What I found for me the most, I would say, his rakshas dike time was at the end of the Atoresa. Each Atoresa, they would sing a niggin. Who would start the niggin? The people in the back of 770 really didn't know. But in the front of 770, you knew. Each Ata Horeisa, the Rebbe himself would start the niggin. Every single one. The Rebbe would turn around and he would start the nigunim. He would start Ala Sela Hochach. He would start Zolshen Zayin, the Geula. Ay, 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 ay. He would start Ya, ay, ay, ay. And then many times at the end of the third one, which we'll see soon about the Pasuk Uforatsto, the Rebbe would start Uporatsto, Uporatsto. The Rebbe would start the niggin and he would dance. He would turn around and make extremely lebedik with the oilam. After each Atoresa. For me, that was a highlight to hear the Rebbe start the nigunim. And the Rebbe would say, Shmini Atzeres or Simchaseinu for sure, and Simchaseinu by day, all the psukim of the first time Ato Areisa, the Rebbe said all the psukim of Ato Areisa. They used to sell some years the psukim of Ato Areisa, and people would buy it and be mechabed the Rebbe to say the pasuk. And they had a seder. One night the money went to the Merkez Niyonei Chinuch. One of the times it went to the Lubavitch Yeshiva, to Temimim, to fund the yeshiva. There were chazokis of how it was by the Frierdiker Rebbe, I believe, of where the money went to from the psukim of Ato Areisa. And the Rebbe was involved. The Gaboyim were there, and the Rebbe would call over the Gabbai and tell him something and tell him something else. The Rebbe was like involved when it came to Simchas Torah in what was going on. In fact, I remember in the year Tavshin Nun Beis, when the Rebbe came into Hakofes on Shmini Atzeres, there was a big balagan. Stuff was happening there. And the Rebbe made his own seder. The Rebbe told people to move away. He pointed. I saw the Rebbe pointed at this person, move away. You, move away. Sit down. You sit down. Stop commanding. And the Rebbe made the whole Olam calm for Hakofes. Then, after the Ato Areisos, they were mechabed the Rebbe with the first Hakofe and also the Rebbe with the seventh Hakofe. So they would mechaber the Rebbe with the first hakofe. They would give the Rebbe the Sefer Torah. Someone had a chazaka to give the Rebbe the Sefer Torah. And the Rebbe would walk from his place all the way to the middle of shul for the hakofes. And other Yidden also got a kibbut to have a Sefer Torah. So my place was in the front. So I was there when the Rebbe got the Sefer Torah. And as the Rebbe walked, it was an unbelievable sight. People would go over and kiss the Rebbe Sefer Torah. People would ask the Rebbe for brachas. People would tell the Rebbe, it's a minig, lept ibrayor, you should live till next year. And the Rebbe would answer, gamatem. For some people, they needed to hear that gamatem, that bracha from the Rebbe. I myself saw kids. I didn't, chas v'sholom, I never said a word to the Rebbe like that. But kids went over to the Rebbe, lept ibrayor. There'd be a big smile, gamatem. And the Rebbe would walk like that, uvgelekt. How do you say uvgelekt? With a smiling face all the way to his hakofe. And then the Rebbe would dance the Rashag with his brother-in-law. The Rebbe would dance for that hakofe until the Rashag wasn't able to dance for hakofes anymore. Tavshin Ches every single year, the whole 770, everybody got up on the benches to be able to see the Rebbe in the Ches, by the bima, dancing hand on hand. The Rebbe would literally dance hand on hand with the Rashag, with his brother-in-law. They would dance. So the Rebbe would stop a few times. The Rashag was sick after he got sick in Tavshin Aleph. The Rebbe would stop and ask him, should I stop? And he would tell the Rebbe, no, he wants to dance more with the Rebbe until he didn't have any koiches anymore. So the Rebbe would stop and dance. His hand was on the Rebbe's shoulder, and the Rebbe would dance with him, mamish, hand on hand. There was a sight, an unbelievable sight. And then the Rebbe would come back. In the year Tavshin Ches, he couldn't come to Hakofes already. So the Rebbe danced alone, then by Hakofes, and that's a whole special Hakofes Tavshin Ches. Now is not the time to describe just Tavshin Ches, but I will describe one particular Hakofes, and then I think we'll conclude. In the year Tavshin Aleph, I was zeicher to be by Hakofes by the Rebbe. That was the year when the Rebbe started Tzivus Hashem. The Rebbe was very, very involved with the kids. So during Hakofes, the Rebbe said a siche, middle of Hakofes, said a siche, and then he said, we're going to have another Hakofes that I'm going to go to. I think it was Hakofes Hey, if I remember correctly. And the Rebbe said, all the kids should go to Hakofes, should go dance in the middle by the Ches. And the Rebbe said, he's going to join the kids to dance by Hakofes, both nights, Shmini Atzeres and Simchas Torah. I remember this, I was a young child. Fathers, everyone sent their kids without the parents. The next year, by the way, the Rebbe made again Hakofes for the kids, but he didn't go. He said last year there was too much, and I think the Rebbe said that the parents should go with the kids. But this year, everyone sent kids over there to Hakofes, and the Rebbe came with his Sefer Torah. I remember this like yesterday, watching this as a kid, being in the Ches together with the Rebbe. The Rebbe's face was literally shining. I remember the niggin. They were singing Utsu Eitzav V'Sufa. And the Rebbe was standing there surrounded by kids, being pushed. I mean, you have no idea what was going on. There's a boy from Miami that they said at the time that he fell down. The Rebbe picked him up with one hand. Picked him up because he fell down right next to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe was giving his Sefer Torah to the kids. The Rebbe was dancing, and there were some adults there. The Rebbe was throwing the adults out of the Ches, asking them to leave. They made place outside of the Ches because there was no room for all the kids. They moved people outside of the Ches and for more kids to be able to come. Can you imagine all the Kinderlach in 770? And the Rebbe danced with the children for that Hakofes. An unbelievable, unbelievable thing that I remember. At the end of the Hakofes, and I'll conclude with this, the Rebbe went back to his place, and I think maybe that's when it started. They started to sing Aleinu. Like by the rallies in camp, they sang Aleinu because all the kids were there singing Aleinu. So sometime during the end of Akofis, the Rebbe turned around, and I was with a few of my friends sitting in front of the Aron Kodesh. They're sort of close to the Rebbe. The Rebbe turns around, and the Rebbe points to me, looked like he was pointing to me like this, and he went like this with his hand. Now I'm sitting there, I'm like, me? The Rebbe doesn't mean me. Who am I? I'm a little kid. No, so of course I ignored the Rebbe. A minute later, the Rebbe does the same thing again. He points like this. Again, I didn't do anything. The Rebbe turned to Rabbi Groner and he told him he wants those kids that are sitting there to come sit next to him, next to the Rebbe, on his bim, mamish, right next to the Rebbe for the end of our coffees. So we all went up and we all sat down right next to the Rebbe there. The Rebbe was smiling. Some kids just took the opportunity, went over to the Rebbe, gave the Rebbe a hand, shalom aleichem, which we don't do. By Chassidim, that's something we don't do. But the kids were like in such a, it's hard to describe, such a mood of closeness to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe gave such a big smile. And I remember the Rebbe putting his hand down and shaking each one of those children's hand, whoever gave the Rebbe a hand. Each one guy did, another kid, and they gave the Rebbe a hand. The Rebbe gave a big smile. And one more thing I'll remember, I'll share with you. I think it was Tafshim Mem Gimel. I was standing right there. There was a yid, a kid actually, who came from Eretz Yisrael. He was an einikol of a famous chassid, and he was there. And another yid went over to the Rebbe and told the Rebbe that this is so and so's einikol, so and so's grandson. I was standing there, so he gave the Rebbe a hand. He himself wasn't raised in a Lubavitch environment, so he had like long payas on his yarmulke. It looked like from the Chassidish Oilam, but his grandfather was a famous Lubavitch chassid. And the Rebbe turned to him and told him the following. I was standing right there. "Those Eiswachsen, a greise chassid, a greise Yerushalayim, und a greise Lamden." That's what the Rebbe told him, standing there in the middle of our coffers to this particular child. So as I conclude, I want to share with you as well, all you talmidim from Kitos Zayin Ches, together with all kinder of Klal Yisrael, you should all grow up to be greise chassidim, greise Yerushalayim, and greise lomdim, that we should be zoiche already by this Yom Kippur Simchaseinu, and even earlier we say L'shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, to be already Yerushalayim Mir HaKodesh, together with the Rebbe, with the Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi, Agmar Chasima Toiva.